So good evening, everyone. My name is David Levy-Four, and I'm today very happy to host Professor Jacint Jordana. Jacint is a close friend of mine, 20 years now, Jacint. I don't know if you are aware. We finished 20 years. We are going into the 21 year. So Jacint, thank you very much for joining us. And Jacint is a professor of political science and administration at the Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona. Is the manager and the founding manager of the Institute of Barcelona, the Etudes Internationals, meaning the Barcelona Institute for International Relations. He is also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Barcelona City Council, the Board of Trustees of Barcelona Center of International Affairs. He is working on comparative public policy, doing multi-level perspective, global governance, and special attention to both EU and regulatory policies and the agencies, specialized agencies for doing regulation. I mentioned the EU because it's so close to us, but he's also a scholar of Latin American studies. He wrote many books, he's highly cited, he's running a few research projects, including now a common project that we just finished, Globe on global governance in Europe, Horizon 2020 project. And I'm happy to have you here to speak about quality assurance and the structure of the institutions that promote quality assurance. Our common idea is that kind of independence or autonomy of agency is important for the quality of governance in all sectors. You do want statistical authorities which tells you the truth statistically. You want to, if you want to trust statistics, better have independent statistical authority. If you want, maybe you want less inflation, it may be better to have independent central bank. And we bring those issues now to quality assurance in higher education. And thank you very much, Jacint, for joining us. So the floor is yours, and please go on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for inviting me to this series on university policies, and also thank you for your nice presentation. Actually, I appreciate very much you try to pronounce IBEI in the Catalan name, no? The Barcelona Institute of International Studies. We're very proud of that. We'll try to share the screen, and I have a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah, focus on on uploading. And now I understand why I found it so difficult. It's not Spanish, it's Catalan that I misspelled. And eBay is a very good place to go and to study and to do research. So lucky us, Jacint, go on.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am going to present a research I did a few years ago on the emergence and the consolidation of quality assurance agencies. This is the name, but we can call them as well independent regulatory agencies in the area of higher education. This is a research project I did together with Michel Pérez Duran and David Sancho and Ana García Juanatey. And we together published an article 1 year ago about that. But well, the research, the project was broader than the article, and we did also a lot of reflections and discussions about the regulatory nature of this, or the regulatory time in university policy in the recent decades. And I think I want to combine raising some concerns, some ideas more general about this regulatory dimension in higher education policy, and also presenting the data that we collected and the index we prepare for measuring the different independence and accountability of these agencies. No? So I will try to mix some more general, more reflections, discussions, and some more specific aspects about these agencies in the area of higher education. So, and then, well, the data we have on is basically on American, Latin American, and European countries. So we present a comparison. It's also interesting to focus more on the European case, because we have having in perspective Europe from another region where these agencies were also very active, and countries decided, governments decided to create a lot of them, also provide some interesting points of comparison between what happened in Europe and what happened in Latin America. No? Still is a lot to do in terms of research to understand these dynamics. But anyway, I think we provide interesting views and also some findings about these developments. But let me start with some aspects more, these broader views about what I can say, that the regulatory turn in higher education. Well, maybe you probably know, most of you, because, well, probably in other seminars also, in David, probably those who are attending these classes, that, well, since the 90s, we saw the development of the regulatory state over the world. No? It was a very successful history, and was a mix of, well, many different phenomena. Well, we observed privatizations, fiscal crisis, liberalization of trade, globalization, expanding globalization, and well, in the midst of all these transformations that many pointed out towards what has been called the neoliberal state or neoliberal turn, we also saw developments that we call the regulatory state, or the emergence of strong processes of regulatory governance. And this is the general framework. And a basic point in my presentation, in general in my approach to this higher education policies, is what happened in higher education since the 90s has to be understood in the context of this broad regulatory expansion over the world. So it's another sector, it's quite different, there are a lot of specificities in higher education policy, but on the other side, it's not something really isolated from these regulatory tendencies. So the idea of having regulatory agencies to, with some level of independence, to steer and to supervise the sector. The idea of using intensively regulatory instruments, having control, but also incentivizing some development of the regulators. Well, the idea of also sometimes to having a less hierarchical state and allowing some degrees of freedom to the actors. So all of these aspects, also the implication of stakeholders, all of these aspects that we have been observing in many different sectors can be also observed in the higher education. And in this sense, this is my main argument, and that has been sometimes because in higher education policy, the word regulation is not used at all. You don't observe the use of the word regulation, but or in general, maybe in few cases, but they prefer to use quality assurance in most cases, or other words. But my argument is that this is really another area of successful development of the regulatory state. And this is the general argument, and I will try to elaborate this with this analysis of these quality agencies that has been expanding almost all over the world. And also I will also tell you something more about this, not only the analysis of the accountability and independence, a little bit about the institutional evolution and the transformations of the institutional model in this sector. Well, actually, what we mean with quality assurance and what is understood as a quality assurance, as probably you know, it's a review process of programs and entities to meet acceptable standards, monitoring its progress and enforcing its accomplishment. This is a standard definition of quality assurance used in higher education. Similar definitions you can observe in many different sectors, from food safety to chemicals. Other, of course, that is not the same, but the idea of this having a standards and developing a standards and as a sort of criteria, rules, measurements to make and to supervise these. This can be a way to assure quality. This is a mentality based on a very standardized processes, in this case of education, higher education, in which it's expected that if you can assure a number of parameters and you can control them, you can finally have an output that has certain level of quality in the way you define this, of course. But this is also something that has a strong influence from different sectors. You don't have to forget that at the development of quality assurance in higher education has been strongly influenced for many professors or natural sciences, technologies, engineers that were very aware of quality assurance process in their industries, on their related industries. And most probably they, when in the 80s or the 90s, they developed quality assurance schemes. They take into their background, they came with the models of quality assurance they have in the areas they were familiar. Well, this can be an hypothesis. I did some interviews years ago, and this was confirmed by some of the people who had relevant positions in some quality assurance agencies in the 90s, early 2000s. But anyway, this is part of why this is the idea of regulation that has been strongly developed by economists and lawyers was not so relevant in the case of higher education, with most people had backgrounds in different people that were, as I said, many university professors were taking positions in these agencies or in the ministries that developed this revolution, were more influenced by probably by other cultures of quality and standardization than developing formal rules, as we know from other sectors. Well, this is a general background about the quality assurance and the age of regulatory governance. I just want to start now with a very impressive data. That is, this is part of the data set. This is not the article that we publish is a limited number of quality agencies. Here we develop the same team, a larger data set, aiming to identify almost all agencies created at the national level in the world in the last 50 years, and came out these results. So we identified 120 agencies over the world. So many countries, not all, but a large number of countries in the world developed quality agencies. Most of these agencies were created in the last 15 years, almost, or between the last data is 2016 here, so probably there are a few more now. But you see enormous expansion in the 2000s. And well, agencies were spread over Latin America, Europe, but also the rest of the world, in particular Asian countries, where they develop a large number of agencies also in the 2000s. So it's also remarkable to see that Latin American countries started to create agencies much before European countries, but over the years, also because there are more European countries than Latin American countries, it comes that now there are more regulatory quality assurance agencies in Europe. But this is a statistical effect because, as I said, there are more small countries in almost all countries in Europe, all countries in Latin America. Only very few exceptions. They have their own one or more quality assurance agencies nowadays. So, but this is from this data you can observe that this is a success history, meaning that the expansion, the diffusion of these agencies was reached all parts of the world, having, of course, differences, and I will refer to this, but in general, the model of creating agency to supervise to the quality of higher education institutions, separated from the government, having autonomy or some level of independence, was a very successful transformation, I would say, no? Because this changed profoundly how the sector was governed, and introduced these ideas of regulatory governance in the higher education sector in the last, I would say, 20 years. Well, these agencies I will analyze more in detail later, but what I can say is that formally separated from governments. In most countries, they are remain of public nature. There are a few cases in which agencies are private or have a sort of non-profit nature, but this is not common. I mean, there are cases in Germany, in other Turkey, of course, it's United States and Mexico, but it's not the dominant model. The dominant model we see over the world in 80% of the cases is the public organization being part of the public sector. Sometimes are public sector, some other times are employees having some capability to have a direct contract to employees, but they have their own organizational structure. They are under public law in most cases, as I said, and what they have is accumulation of professional capacities. No? In many cases, they have professional capacities because they they attract experts, professional people with expertise in education studies, people education and learning. Sometimes also they integrate experts, committees from professors from universities in different disciplines, but there are agencies having the capability to integrate a strong knowledge capacities on learning, on education at the higher levels, so in the higher education or even doctorate, and they assess and establish, define standards and implement standards, supervise in the areas of the different aspects of higher education. On the one side, we can say there are many arguments to why this happened, no? Beyond general arguments that you can be used in general expansion of the regulatory state. No? But one argument is that because in many countries there is a large part of the universities that are public, and separating quality agencies from the executive, it increases the credibility of the supervisory task of agencies, because then the assessment of the quality is not in the hands of the government who is funding these agencies, these universities, the public universities. So this creates a sort of a credibility scheme that can help to make sense of the development of quality assurance agencies. But on the other side, quality agencies has been also useful to supervise and have strict controls on private universities. It's the case in many Latin American countries where the growing independence and when quality agencies become stronger, in particular during the 2010s, they were able to have a really strong capacity to supervise the quality of private universities that in the past, in the 2010, in the 2000s or in the 90s, these universities were protected by politicians in the legislative or in the executive, and these politicians, with having interest in the private universities recently created, had prevented the government in many cases to supervise strictly the private university. So the creation of these more autonomous, more independent quality assurances become an asset for, to some extent, to the government, to be separate from the politicians, to have more strong quality supervision on private universities. And in many Latin American countries, quality agencies were capable to even to close a number of private universities that didn't meet the established standards without the support of the government, and sometimes against the pressures that came from politicians in the executive or the parliament. So it was completely inverse to the case that we may think is the standard in Europe, thinking that they are more credible because the public sector is funding public universities. In this case, they become more credible because they separated from the government to assess the quality of private universities. So you see that sometimes some arguments can be completely different according to the situation in each country. No? In any case, how this model expanded over the world is something that, well, still requires more research. We didn't perform a diffusion analysis of this. It's clear that it was a case of diffusion. Also, it's a very interesting case that, as I said, I haven't done the research, but you have to have in mind that the quality assurance agencies started in the United States as a private agencies, in many cases established by university associations or related to universities as a way to establish a quality distinction to the best universities and to avoid bad quality universities, not to prohibit them, but just to not to provide them with accreditation. So it's a private model, and this private model over this regulatory state diffusion transformed it into a public regulatory agency. There are some between models, as the cases of Mexico and Germany, that require sometimes more detailed analysis. But what became the standard model of quality assurance agencies that expanded, as I said, over the world in most countries was a public agency, public funded agency, public employees, autonomous or independent even, but not an NGO or not a private one as the origins. It was during the process of diffusion in the early stages, the model transformed itself in a sort of a transition from a private model or a private agency model to a public model. And also it transformed from being a model of agency that operated in competition with other agencies that sometimes were also active in the same sector or in very close areas of learning. And it moved towards agencies that had sort of territorial monopoly. So each agency had particular state territory or a subnational state territory to implement, to do the supervision of quality assurance. This is also a big change that happened for the early origins to current situation. But still, this is not final end of this model. We still can see in cases like Turkey or other countries, even Germany or other sometimes Austria, that there are mixes of the two models. No, the competition model where agencies are having the capacity to expand and to compete one to another to provide accreditations and to compete for delivering good quality, well-respected accreditations to universities after, of course, doing the revision. That happens, this, for example, in the case of still in masters in MBAs, but not in 90% of the sectors in education. So we still see that there are some areas in which the competition model still exists, but what has been expanding diffusion over the world is the public territorially monopolistic and hierarchical agency model. So it's a very interesting phenomenon because over the diffusion it transformed towards more standard model. And here the model was resembling this standard public agency, independent what they adapted is more of the characteristics of standard regulatory, independent regulatory agencies that were operating and were expanding at the same time in many other sectors, no? From a very different nature initially in the 90s or even before. Well, it's a very interesting history that requires probably more analysis, but I think, or at least these are my understanding based on this research I explained before and a number of interviews, and also trying to track the historic institutional evolution of these agencies. Today, also these agencies, they have very common standards. So there is a standard procedures to implement, there are standard regulatory instruments, and they have differences as to the level of independence, how they are accountable, the number or the scope of responsibilities they have, because some agencies also include the accreditation of teaching staff. Other agencies include accreditation of PhD programs. Some agencies also are accrediting universities. Other agencies, they do accreditation of single programs. There is a large diversity of responsibilities, no, that each agency, each country may have, and sometimes there are even a couple of agencies in a country distributing these responsibilities. No? But in general, they do this type of task, and they apply very standard instruments that circulate over the world in different networks and different types of conferences and other forms in which the standard for policy instruments are shared and discussed very intensively in different committees. Well, this I already explained it. So this, maybe it's important to mention this international network of experts. Well, they also contributed intensively to the expansion of this standard model public quality assessment agency. No, actually, probably there are the most important are the European one, the European Network for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, which is very active in Europe and not European Union, beyond also neighbor countries as well. And then we have the International Network for Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education, which is a worldwide network, what we can say an informal international organization, which has some relevant structure. And also these agencies not only are contributing to share knowledge and to define a standard set of instruments, and they organize annual meetings, but also these agencies also has established as a standard of what is an independent quality assurance agency. They assess the quality, the independence of agencies at the national level. They provide a sort of stamp if the agency fits all of the characteristics that they think that are relevant to be independent, to be separate from the government. So they are very active, quite powerful, and well, in a way, they are setting standards that most cases are adopted by most national quality assurance agencies. So this is the wall of these quality assurance agencies. And well, this is just general other areas, data on expansion of other areas, just to show you that they are very similar pace of expansion. And just briefly now, let me explain the index we elaborate based on a number of national quality assurance agencies in European and Latin American countries. And we try to the three axes or three dimensions. One is the independence. The other was the accountability towards society stakeholders. And the third one was the scope of policy and regulatory responsibility. The index was based on identifying just formal characteristics of quality, and we identified 38 characteristics. It means that was based on legal characteristics. To this purpose, we track legal text, and we identify all these characteristics. And the variables were based on another research I did with other colleagues on measuring independence and accountability of regulatory agencies. What we did with not a copy and paste, but an adaptation of the variables on measuring independence, accountability, scope of responsibility, adapted to the world of quality assurance. So this is not, in this sense, we cannot compare directly, because maybe there are 20 variables that are same exactly, but there are many other variables that are different because they include aspects that are relevant for this sector, as for example, the type of responsibilities, or some aspects of accountability considering the relation with universities, aspects that are sector specific that are not included in the data set on regulatory agencies I did also some years ago. Well, here you can see more detail, the type of variables we included for this index. Basically, well, we had an initial sample, but as I said, we only included this European and Latin America. That means that sometimes can be NGOs, but having some type of public or state strong support, no? And for this reason, we also included these cases. And also we avoid including agencies being specialized in a specific area, not just regular quality assurance agencies for business or for engineering. We just included agencies having a general scope in higher education institutions. Well, here you can see maybe later, but we tried to identify these variables using legal text. We weighted the cluster according to the independence of the head, the board, and the non-accountability to the executive. No, if the agency was not accountable to the executive, we counted higher, no, to measure the level of political independence. And here you can see the results through this. Well, there's a number of the country, and just in the cases there are two agencies included, to put the name of the agency. But you can see from agencies, some agencies in Latin America are among the higher, who have a higher political independence cluster. In some of the countries that have not a weak state, we can say, even taking into account the average in Latin America, and also some countries in Europe. So not the more powerful states have the more independent, formally independent quality assurance agencies. No? Well, this is a social accountability cluster where we measure the relations with social society stakeholders, including here, for example, faculty, students, employers, administrative staff, alumni. And here we see also that a large majority of agencies having a higher indicators for social accountability came from Europe, where still there are few from South America. And the last one is the scope of responsibilities. Here you see different activities that the quality assurance that these agencies can perform. And here you see also the distribution of these responsibilities. Just to provide you some results about the comparison between Europe and Latin America, we observed that in general, the political autonomy, the average between Latin American and European agencies is very similar. You see here that one is 0.57 and Latin American is 0.58. So it's almost no difference. Maybe there is even some differences in the executive accountability, but in general, it's not that relevant. It's they have a similar, in average, they have similar levels of political autonomy. So it doesn't mean that European agencies are more independent than the Latin American. One may expect that they were less. At least formally, there is no difference. But where we find a strong difference is in social accountability cluster, where European agencies tend to be much more accountable to different stakeholders compared to Latin American. You can see here 0.5 versus 0.26. And also, European agencies tend to have a broader scope of responsibilities, maybe not that much difference, but still from 0.6 to 0.47, still there is some important difference. So agencies are not so different, and if they are different, they are particularly different from Europe to Latin America in the area of social accountability. Sorry. And then I want to go to another aspect that I think it's important to understand the logic of quality assurance agencies, is to what extent they are also independent, not only from the state or the government, but also from universities. And here we found out that there are two very different models how countries approach this issue. There are countries that created agencies that are very, very separated from universities. I can say that most of the countries opted for this option. No? What we say here, the column low university role. You can see that there are a large number of countries that there are no representatives of universities in the councils, or there are very few in the councils of the board that quality agencies have established. On the other side, there are other countries, many Europeans, but not only, that also some Central American countries that have universities have a high role. It's a sort more of self-organization or self-regulation or approaching self-regulation, where universities are really important in the management or in the having a strong presence in the board of quality assurance agencies. And there are some intermediate cases. And thereafter, there are also a second axis that we identified is what we call representation versus expertise. No? Here means that representation means when universities appoint delegates or sometimes vice rectors or people who are appointed by the rector because they are part of the government of the university as a member of the board or relevant positions in the quality agency. And then we say expertise when the universities, if they have a role, they have a role because they send experts that are appointed by the university, people who came from education, pedagogic or education activities, or sometimes they are professors for education or for psychology, that they are part of the board, of the advisory board of the agencies, and they can be suggested the names or proposed by universities, but because they have expertise to do this, and then this is. But as you can see, in many cases, what we see is that the universities in the boards they propose or appoint a number of experts, but not a majority. No, because for this reason we put them in the low university role. Only in very few countries, almost known, universities having a high role appoint a majority of members of the board based on expertise. No? Only this, and I would say that very poor countries in Central America, for example, as Honduras or Costa Rica. Well, Costa Rica is not that poor, but Haiti. They used to be in this way because they really they ask the support of larger public universities, sometimes the most traditional or the dominant, most important university in the country, to do part of these quality assurance processes. So they created the agency, but in fact, the agency in many cases is strongly related to the technical or professionals that are in the main, the dominant public university in the country. No? And in this way, there is no clear separation between this university, that is the more relevant or more respected university in the country, and the people that are working in the agency. There is no a big separation. So in this way, you can see different configurations where in few cases, quality agencies are not independent from universities, but it's more a model of self-regulation somehow, and cases in which they are completely separate or they have a very minor involvement, and also the governments who created these agencies are worried not to be captured by universities in general, not avoiding the university associations or big universities to have too strong influence in the agency, to prevent. So there are really two different institutional models that we were able to observe in analyzing the diversity. Well, just to conclude my presentation, let me say something. Well, maybe a big concluding remark is that our data came from legal sources, the Jure approach. So most probably, the actual levels of independence and accountability can be quite different. The difference between formal and informal can be very different in many countries. Some countries with weaker states, they may pretend to have a strong legislation providing a lot of independence to the agency, formal, but then in the real life, they are not able to keep this working on. And in many cases, they are under the strong influence of the minister or maybe the universities. So this can be a case. And I didn't research on the de facto independence or de facto accountability in this sector. A second issue that I can say is that there is no big difference between European and Latin American agencies, despite the situation is very different, political institutions, traditions, different, of course, the role of universities with a major presence of private universities in Latin America, but there is no large, very different model. They have differences, as we saw, but this also can be related to the strong expansion and rapid expansion, the diffusion of this institutional model of public quality assurance agency, that didn't allow to a lot of adjustments to the characteristics of each country. And in any case, what I can say you is that agencies in Latin America, also in Europe, but in Latin America, started earlier, but they were very independent and very accountable, and they become more and more independent over the years. So the creation of international networks, the European models that were created in the 2000s, serve also a reference to reinforce the independence of quality assurance agencies in Latin America that would become reinforced and were more strong in the 2010s. But still, and despite this, we can see in some countries, in Latin American countries in particular, but also in some European, some remaining influence of the American US model based on private agencies and some structures based on self-regulation of universities. Still, you can see the case of Mexico with very different ways of adjusting or hybridization with many, many different differences, and sometimes difficult to track how become or crystallize a particular configuration in these cases of hybridization of US model and standard public quality assurance model. Well, and basically, this is, well, there are some other differences I refer here. but as I say, there is not a lot of differences, but also not a identical level. No? There is some level of adaptation, but without configuring different, completely different models in Latin America and Europe. Well, that's. I think I will stop here with talking too much, probably more than I expected, and we're happy to have your questions and comments.
So thank you very much, Jacint. I'm sure there are questions. There are also questions on the in the chat, but let me ask you first and take the prerogative to ask. Does it matter really? Can you say that more independence from the university and from politics leads to a quality of higher education? I have another question because I was so short and brief, I will allow myself a second one. So please, Jacint.
Well, I didn't
check that
on the impact of independence on the quality of universities. I really even accountability. We try to measure this formal. We don't know about informal, and we don't know about. This is a general problem in regulatory governance studies, no? That we have been, because it's more difficult to assess this, and sometimes indicators are not so clear because you can measure how universities perform, but there are so many factors having an influence that to isolating the effect of independence.
Yeah. But Jacint, I know that what I want to have is your gut feeling, because we don't have more than that.
My feeling more in agencies in Catalonia is that independence is an asset for agencies that is less practiced than is stated. So informally, most agencies are less independent than they are formally explicit. But it depends, of course, a lot on who is the director, who is the president of the agency, how agency is backed by board and the committees. But if they have this independence, they can play with this and have more power in sometimes implementing, discussing with the government or with universities. And when they don't have any independence, they just do what the government is asking to do them. And sometimes the government is not looking just for best results, but just for windows dressing or some other type of non-program policy.
We know it from Israel. There is now a kind of cap. There is it's awful, but I'll leave it in that. I'd like to ask you: self-governance, self-regulation in higher education, is it good? And you are a manager in the system as well, senior or vice rector and so on. So
I am in favor of the independence of universities. That's clear, no? As more independence, the better.
The better for whom? For the public or for the academia?
No, I think for the public. I think a different thing is that sometimes, well, the independence cannot bring good results for everybody. No, sometimes they are mistakes, and some people, some universities can use independence or autonomy, large autonomy, to be successful, but others can do mistakes or can be captured by internal or external interests and can be a disaster. No? That you have more variety, but I am in favor of more experimentation and more diversity. The other thing is at the level of the system, whether I am in favor of self-regulation. Not really. I don't think. I think that is the case of the UK is the best example, no? Because the UK has a strong tradition of self-regulation. And still there is a lot of self-regulation in UK compared to most European countries. But still, they have been introducing some limiting the self-regulation, no, because of pathologies of that, no, looking for the minimum common denominator, the last criteria. So I don't think it's good, the self-regulation. I think that universities, they are required to have some external regulation, maybe not so much, but good regulation from quality agencies and for the government, of course, or the parliament. But I'm not in favor. Maybe some aspects, more detailed questions, but this is more for a second layer of regulation, no, not for providing autonomies a lot of political autonomy.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's open the floor for questions. I will go back to the text, but I want to allow for question. Mauricio, do you want to ask? Yaakov, anyone else? So let's read Mauricio's questions from the text. In the case of Latin America, you have very significant regional differences within the same countries. And then regarding the case of US influence, like the case of Tech Monterey, I'm not sure what we are talking about. Maybe Mauricio or you know. What is the role of local regulatory actors? How regionalization come into play?
Well, let me say first, I saw another this is about always teaching quality, not research quality. These agencies, most of the agencies, they don't care, or they just secondarily focus on research, no? They focus on teaching education in general. As to the
can you repeat that? You say most of these agencies are on research, not on teaching?
No, are on teaching, not on research.
Okay, so why? How comes that research is not subject for quality assurance? Is it because of the global ranking and so on?
No, because research has a different type of assessment. No, well, in many cases, there are agencies to assess research projects, and there are some projects that are providing resources for teams or for departments. But these agencies don't focus on this, don't provide resources. That's assess quality of teaching, of education, more broadly understood. But and sometimes they assess the quality of research to the extent this is also a good input for teaching, but no more than that. This is very, very general. Only very few cases agencies have some research assessment. It's not very common. Yeah. And in the case of Latin America, you ask about the local regional differences. Well, Mexico is a federal state, but there are few states at the federal level, having a federal level in Latin America. But in most cases, quality assurance agencies are national level. There are not many, almost to my knowledge, almost nothing, cases of regional quality assurance agencies. Of course, there are local and regional differences because sometimes they are universities are supported by regional governments, cities, and sometimes they have a strong influence. This is the case of Mexico, and this can be if the governments at the regional level having a good strategy, they can boost the universities. Actually, the case of Tech of Monterrey is a very particular case because now it's a system of more than 40 different campuses over all Mexico with a strong US influence, but it's a private university and has been successful imitating, adapting to the Mexico, the very standard American university. And some cases, Tech Monterrey, they are using US accreditation. It's part of this hybridization of American and European or standard public system of accreditation. The Tech Monterrey is playing in these very complex cases as the case of Mexico.
Thank you. There is a a question there from Etty Zaltzman. You probably can read it as well, but I will read it for the viewers. What actions, if at all, are required to achieve uniform global Q&A, quality assurance in the global level? Yeah, this is the first question. So global standard quality assurance or assessment in leading countries, are they creating maybe via the OECD global standard or OECD standard?
Are very now are circulating fast, and almost all countries, all agencies in the world, they have information about which are the cutting edge standards for quality assurance. The problem is how to adapt the standards to your country or your case, no? And which of the standards you think that makes sense to implement, and which ones you can be more flexible given the situation in your university. An important thing is standards are for qualifying the minimum level of the university quality. No, you can ask many countries that the big role of these agencies is to avoid bad quality universities, is to forbid them or to prevent them, not to make one university a top level university. This is not the role of agencies. And in any case, this is just to prevent minimum levels of quality, to assure. Of course, there is a university that wants to be a top level university. This is the task of the government or the private funders, or to be very successful in the market, whatever, but it's not the role of the quality assurance agency. It's not the focus. The strategy of agencies is not to create a class of top level universities.
I see. Yeah, thank you for that. Perhaps one last question, unless somebody wants to come in. And the question is about the relations between the quality assurance in higher education and quality assurance in secondary education, primary education, and of course the structure of the Bavarian ministry, and how it all sits together. Is it really separation of higher education from the rest of the education system in this regard? So the ministry stays in control for secondary and primary education? Do you know?
Very few cases of agencies, they take into their scope of responsibilities primary or secondary education. It's a very clear case that almost 90% of the countries in having agencies, they have agencies at the tertiary level, higher education, and few countries have also agencies for primary and secondary, separated agencies. Many other countries, they don't have agencies for primary and secondary. They have some type of units for assessment, and of course doing issuing regulations inside the ministry. So the logic of independent agency has not been expanding to the primary and secondary. Also because this is the organization of primary and secondary education is very hierarchical, at least within the public domain, and in the private it's very market oriented, and when there is a public money also is hierarchical to some extent. So there is no the independence that many countries' universities have, that create this sort of triangle that requires some type of more transparency and also some independent actor to assess the activity, no?
Yeah. So last question from Cesar Cordova. Cesar, do you want to come in, or shall I read your questions? Cesar? So I'll read the question from...
Yeah, I'm here, sorry. I was pushing buttons.
Please, Cesar.
No, how can you manage the wall, the necessary wall between evaluating and recommending? how to avoid, for instance, when the evaluators provide recommendations to increase the ranking, and in effect, you're one way creating a conflict between judge and party. Is there rules, limits? I know it's transparency, but is there other things that you can verify this conflict, or at least this conflict of judge and party?
Well, this happens sometimes, but also one way to avoid this beyond transparency is to avoid to rank universities. No? In many cases, the assessment is just pass or fail, but not ranking, not providing grades. There's countries they do. For example, the case of Chile is very particular. They have a system of providing accreditation for a number of years. And the best accreditation, they give 7 years of freedom without renewing the accreditation. And the worst, they allow the universities only 1 year. This is a way of ranking them. But in many countries, they don't provide ranking. They are completely separate from ranking agencies. And this is a way to avoid rankings. No?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all. Thank you very much, Jacint Jordana. Have a nice evening wherever you are. And we are coming in from Europe and the Middle East, but also Latin America. So maybe also from Latin America, or at least Spain. Thank you very much, all, and see you again in the next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions.